9th, 2023. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Jackson, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
It is my honor and a privilege to share the podium today with my esteemed colleague, Sheila Sherfless McCormick. As we embark on this significant CBC Special Order Hour, in the hour that's come, we're going to dive deep into understanding how terms like colored people have shaped our racial conversation and histories. This isn't just an exploration of the past. It is about how we forge our future. We'll be tackling the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mr. Speaker, across every field and sector, we are seeing a retreat on this promise. And we're going to stress why it's so vital that our education system is inclusive, recognizing and celebrating our racial diversity rather than suppressing it. We see a future where understanding our collective past enables us to shape a more equitable society. Remember this, conversation isn't just about us or Congress. It is a conversation for every single American, because together we can make a difference. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from the great state of New Jersey, Mr. Donald Payne, Congressman Donald Payne, Jr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me thank the gentleman from Illinois for the opportunity to discuss this term that was used in this very chamber just last week. Colored people was a term used to describe African Americans during a debate that was negative. Colored people, a term that hadn't heard in quite some time. Colored people are what the signs above water fountains, outside of bathrooms, in train stations, in bus stations, a part of life that African Americans had to deal with to show the separation, the inequality, the second-class citizenship that we were relegated to for so long. Was it a mistake? I'm sure the gentleman from Arizona feels it was now. But sometimes the truth comes out. And it was during a discussion on diversity in the military and how we don't want to spend, or the loyal opposition doesn't want to spend military dollars on diversity and inclusion. Let's separate the armed forces again. Whites over there, colored people over there. Let's go back. Let's make America great again. That's what that's all about. Going back to someone's good old days. when they were comfortable, when they felt they were supreme, when they thought that they had the upper hand. We don't want equality. We want to go back to the good old days. Let's make America great again. We don't want diversity in the military. That's not for the military to decide. Let's go back. The insult. And I was here, Mr. Speaker. I was on the floor when the gentleman was discussing this. And I rise today to discuss the derogatory term, colored people, and support the need for diversity in programs nationwide. Last week, the MAGA House Republicans from Arizona used the term colored people to describe African Americans and other minorities. He used the term very comfortably, although I think it slipped out. He used it when he discussed his amendment to reject diversity initiatives in the military. And he said his amendment would prohibit discrimination in the armed forces. Clearly, he needs to enroll in one of the diversity courses that he wants to ban. Discrimination has a long history in our country, including hiring in the armed forces. His amendment rejects the success of diversity hiring initiatives in the military, and it could return our country to a time when race was the only factor in who got hired and who got promoted in the military. But let me return to his use of the term colored people. Historically, the term colored has always been used to separate the races into two classes and justify the discrimination that would follow such a separation. It made it legal to have that discussion. It made people comfortable because someone has to be on the top, someone has to be on the bottom in this country. And we've been used against each other for years. The ruling class, the rich, have always pointed people on the bottom at each other so they fight for the crumbs while they stay aloof and get the riches. Colored was also to describe African Americans, and it has its roots in slavery. Laws and official documents define slaves as Negroes, mulattoes, and other colored people. After slavery, Southern states enacted the Jim Crow era of segregation to deny African Americans their rights. Stores and institutions use the term colored to identify bathrooms, water fountains, and other facilities, as I stated. And these facilities were always inferior and usually unsafe. But the Arizona Republican and his colleagues do not want to talk about the past, this past. They want to live in a fantasy where such discrimination never happened. It didn't exist, but it did happen. And discrimination like it is still happening to me, my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, and millions of African Americans nationwide. Even the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives is not safe from it. This is why diversity programs are so vital to our national interest. And Mr. Speaker, I can continue on, and my colleague from Illinois, I could go on forever, but I know there are other members that would like to express their outrage on this issue. We cannot go back. We're not going back. And to people who live in that space, just know you need to be very careful because that is a slippery slope. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.
I would thank the Honorable Donald Payne Jr. for his remarks from the great state of New Jersey. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Chairman Stephen Horsford from the great state of Nevada.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, Congressman Jonathan Jackson, and to commend you and Congresswoman Sheila Sherfilis-McCormick for co-chairing tonight's special order hour. I rise today with my colleagues of the Congressional Black Caucus to address the recent comments made on the House floor by Representative Eli Crane of Arizona during last week's debate on the National Defense Authorization Act. While offering an amendment that would prohibit the Pentagon from participating in race-based concepts in hiring, promotion, or retention in our military, Representative Crane stated that the military was never intended to be, quote, inclusive, unquote, adding that the military strength is, quote, not in its diversity, unquote. Representative Crane would go on to refer to black servicemen and servicewomen who defend our country with their lives as, quote, colored people, unquote. These words hearken back to a dark and racist time in our country's history and should not be tolerated. Representative Crane's comment on the House floor was unprofessional, wholly inappropriate, and unbecoming of a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Furthermore, to have a word like that spoken anywhere but here on the House floor in the year 2023 actually speaks to the very need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sadly, in the days since, we have heard from members on the other side of the aisle who have tried to provide cover for Representative Crane. So we need to be absolutely clear here tonight. For a member of this body to use the words, quote, colored people in this chamber in 2023 is unconscionable, and it calls for nothing short of full condemnation. From the Speaker of this body to the leadership on the other side of the aisle, to those who claim to be allies of the Congressional Black Caucus, your silence is deafening. Representative Crane has publicly stated that he misspoke during debate. However, he has yet to formally apologize directly to his colleagues, including our former chair, the previous chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Representative Joyce Beatty, who was handling debate on the very amendment before this body. Or to the servicemen and servicewomen who deserve far more respect than the indignity of being reduced to a racial slur on the House floor. To our veterans service members who have had to deal with the consequences of segregation in our military, of being referred to colored even on the battlefields while fighting for our freedom and our justice. When Representative Crane said last week while defending his amendment was shocking, but it was not unsurprising, given what the Republicans have shown us every single day on this issue. Right now, in fact, the U.S. Marine Corps is without a confirmed commandant for the first time in over 160 years. Why? All because one senator believes his political agenda is more important than the service members of our military. And that same senator went on to say he thinks that white nationalists aren't racist. Well, what are they then? MAGA Republicans have made it their entire political agenda to fight against, quote, wokeism. Every time they use the word woke, I think they mean black. They want to ban diversity. They want to ban equity and inclusion programs and erase black history from the classrooms. Ironically, what Representative Crane's comments made clear is that the very diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that they fight against are necessary. They're necessary in boardrooms, in our schools, in the halls of Congress, and yes, in our military, which grows more diverse every day. In fact, more than 40% of our service members today are service members from a broad array: African American, Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, who are serving our country and do not deserve to be called anything other than honorable. Instead of prioritizing military readiness and the needs of our service members, MAGA Republicans are more concerned with stoking culture wars to appease their base, which will only make it more difficult to recruit service members from diverse backgrounds. In fact, I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee, and when we were discussing this in committee, I put into the record a report from the Gold Star families who conducted a survey of our service members and their family, who expressed the very concerns around racial tolerance, discrimination, as a factor of whether or not people wanted to join the military. So if you're so concerned about recruitment, you might actually want to focus on eliminating the issues of hate, discrimination, and white supremacy in the military. So my message here tonight, along with my colleagues, is not only will the Congressional Black Caucus continue to call for Representative Crane to make a formal apology to this body, as well as to the service members that were disrespected, but we also want to state in no uncertain terms that his views on diversity in the military are misguided. Representative Crane, Representative Gates, Senator Tuberville, we're not going back. We're not going back to the days of the 1950s. We're not going back to when our communities were segregated. We're not going back to when the term colored people was normalized. We're not going back here on the House floor, and we're not going back in America. And we will not be silenced. Our military is stronger when it reflects the entire American experience. Now, it's unfortunate, and in fact, it pains me that this must be said in 2023. But diversity is our nation's strength, not its burden. And instead of using it as a culture war issue, a wedge issue, I hope that the Speaker of this body will condemn the remarks of Representative Crane and anyone else who would try to bring that type of divisive language to this body. I want to commend my colleagues for being here tonight. I know that this is an issue that strikes to the core of who we are and who we represent. We understand that when we lift up the black community, we lift up everybody. The Congressional Black Caucus may stand for the 80 million people across the country, but we stand for all Americans. And yes, we stand for our service members in the military. May God bless them, and may God bless the United States of America. I yield back.
I thank the Honorable Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Stephen Horsford from the great state of Nevada. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty from the great state of Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, first let me say thank you to the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Stephen Horsford, for shaping our message tonight and reminding us so eloquently of what our role is to be here as a member of Congress, as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, representing the some 80 million Americans and some 18 million Black Americans. To our special order hour chairs, the gentleman from Illinois and the gentlewoman from Florida, thank you for your leadership role. Thank you for your opening remarks, reminding us that words matter, reminding us that as leaders, those elected to represent diverse bodies across this wonderful America that we live in. Thank you to my classmate, Congressman Donald Payne, for giving us a history, for setting the record straight. Mr. Speaker, we are here today because we want America to know how important our work is. We want them to know when we say we are woke, we are proud. We are speaking to constituents across America. For somehow my colleagues have started with that, turning that into a negative. Well, we are very clear that we are very woke. We are woke about what's needed to all constituents, and we are fighting for everyone. But yes, we clearly stand up and represent Black America. So I rise today to join my colleagues in shedding light on the deeply derogatory term that has perpetuated the pain and suffering endured by Black Americans throughout history. The term that was used by a member of this chamber just a few days ago, colored people. It was equally as disturbing, Mr. Chair, that he made reference to DE&I as lowering standards, getting less than. Well, today, I rise as a strong supporter of DE&I. Through the bold leadership of then Chairwoman Maxine Waters, chair of the prestigious Financial Services Committee, I was appointed by her as the first ever D&I chair of the Subcommittee of Diversity and Inclusion under the powerful Financial Services Committee. Now, I mention this for a reason, Mr. Chairman. We brought in the largest financial institutions in this nation, CEOs of companies like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and the list goes on and on. And each one of those CEOs under oath testified that they were committed to DE&I because it was a good business thing and it would make a difference in this country. And they hired DE&I corporate executives across America, not because it was lowering standards, not because they were employing people who were less than, but because they had an understanding in this America that we live in that makes us more united, and it helps us avoid the culture wars that I am sadly seeing on this floor. And today, Mr. Speaker, I stand here as a Black woman, proud to serve all of my constituents. But today is very personal and somewhat emotional for me because I'm standing here in the same spot that I stood in last week, where I am now reminded that I was faced to deal with in 2023 what I heard on this floor. On this floor, Mr. Speaker, the people's house, I am forced to deal with what for centuries Black Americans have been subjected to: systemic oppression, denied human rights, and treated as lesser human beings simply because of the color of their skin. Phrases like this have no place on the House floor, in Congress, or anywhere else. This term, more commonly used in the Jim Crow years, a phrase that is deeply offensive and considered as a slur to delineate Black Americans as less than. And it carries the historical burden of pain and violent discrimination, widespread inequality, and segregation. So, Mr. Speaker, as I come to a close, let me just share with you that we live in a world where in the United States of America is the superpower on the global stage because of our rich diversity, and something that is to be celebrated, not used as a tool to shame not only us, but those servicemen who signed up to put their life on the line for this country. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, what would John Lewis say? Because so many of my Republican colleagues proudly quote him, see something, say something. I'm feeling like what Shirley Chisholm must have thought when she was the only female to be one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus, and to stand on this House floor as a Black woman, having to deal with the things that we are having to deal with now. And certainly I could go on and do a roll call of many other Black Americans, white Americans, and brown Americans who have stood on this floor defending this House. This word should not be allowed to be used as a tool to shame or admonish those who are systemically marginalized or oppressed. I know well what the consequences that have come as a result of systemic discrimination, whether by policy or by everyday hate speech. Each of us, Mr. Speaker, in this body is responsible for challenging and dismantling systems of discrimination that have perpetuated throughout our society. So I'm going to offer a resolve. We've heard our chairperson say, no apologies. Seen a few statements on social media, but since the Speaker of the House issued a statement that there was no place for this, the leader of the House supported that the words be taken down, there is an issue that can help me with resolve. You see, several of us as Democrats and members of the Congressional Black Caucus, we have a piece of legislation that says Black history is American history. If we really believe in bipartisanship, if Representative Crane, as he said, wanted to amend his words because he did not mean that, and somewhere on social media he evoked God and that this was causing him with his team, then let's have all of our members recognize that there are so many things that Black Americans did because Black history is American history. If we had the time, I could rattle off a list of things that we are allowed to do because a Black person invented it. A Black person designed it. So if we really meant to say people of color, then let me say people of color have led and continue to lead this nation. A Black man served as president of these United States. A Black woman serves as vice president of these United States. And right here in the spot that you are standing, Mr. Speaker, a Black man for the first time in the history of this country became sworn in by this body as the leader in this House and held that most sacred gavel to put in the hands of the Speaker. So as I end, I will use my voice and my platform to make the world a better place for my children, for all of the children, grandchildren, and my grandchildren, so Spencer and Leah will know that they too will be valued as strong Black Americans. And I charge all of my colleagues to do the same. And to our chairs, I yield back.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty for her remarks. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Congresswoman Robin Kelly from the great state of Illinois.
Thank you so much to my colleague from Illinois and my colleague from Florida. Mr. Speaker, for centuries, Black Americans have been denied the right to define our own existence. How we live, how we work, and how we raise our children have been judged, appraised, scorned, and dismissed. To this day, we must fight back against harmful stereotypes and brutal discrimination. There are forces that seek to maintain the status quo that discriminates against Black Americans. And these forces don't just wear white hoods. Racism can be subtle. It persists because too many people fail to notice or don't want to notice how bias and discrimination infect the systems in which we live our lives. They claim colorblindness and deride wokeness, when in actuality, they fail to look out and see the world around them for what it is. This is the failure that leads a member of Congress to utter such an offensive phrase on the floor of this body, to insult me and my colleagues on the floor of this sacred chamber. This is why we refuse to back down when Republicans propose cutting programs that promote diversity and educate us on our history. Because it's not just about history. Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth. Black Americans are more likely to be victims of gun violence. Black Americans are more likely to be denied the right to vote. Black Americans are likely to be saddled with crushing student debt. We face these disparities because of systems that were built to exclude us. When Republicans oppose diversity and inclusion, they are not just denying our history. They seek to resurrect the worst impulses of our history. We cannot and we will not let them. Nothing less than the fate of our democracy is on the line. I yield back.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Robin Kelly from Illinois for her remarks. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Sherfless McCormick from the great state of Florida.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank my co-anchor, Representative Jonathan Jackson from the great state of Illinois. Last week, a colleague of mine on the other side of the aisle referred to Black service members as colored people on the very floor we stand on today. I, like many of my esteemed Congressional Black Caucus colleagues, could not believe what I was hearing. As a person of color, it was jarring. Not only was the congressman's comment beneath the office he was elected to serve, but it was a stinging reminder that racism is very much alive in today's day and age. We see it everywhere, from the highways we drive on to the neighborhoods plagued with disinvestment, and as we have learned, we can see it even here on the congressional floor and in the halls of Congress. Despite the progress we've made as a nation, a dark cloud of racism looms directly over our heads, and we hear about it and see it every single day. Unfortunately, Congressman Crane is not alone. Republican Senator Tuberville has struggled to denounce white nationalism. Let me be clear, the term colored people is a racist and antiquated term, and is simply beyond the pale. In no place should it be used to should be tolerated, and certainly not on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. It was Maya Angelou who once said, "When people show us who they are, believe them the first time." Last week, Congressman Crane showed the Republican Party's true colors and their agenda. It is plain as day to see that their roots and what they're trying to push us back to is in a day and age where racism and white supremacy actually led the way. Their attacks on DEI is astonishing and is an attempt to roll us back into the days, that the dark and gloomy days of the United States when we did not embrace and see each other as equals. As we stand here today, not only should these words be stricken, but every member of this body should stand in alliance with the Congressional Black Caucus to denounce these terms and to vow to never return back to the day and age where we saw Black people as less than or colored people as less than. I yield back to my co-anchor.
I'd like to thank the Honorable Sheila Sherfilis McCormick for her remarks from the great state of Florida. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas.
I thank the gentleman very much. I thank both the gentleman from Illinois and the gentlelady from Florida for their consistent and determined presence to bring to the American people truth and, of course, inspiration. Thank you both for your great leadership, and thank you to Chairman Horsford, Congressional Black Caucus. I think we are noted around the nation and around the world for this outstanding presentation every single week that enlightens people's minds and hearts, and they do it with great information. Let me take just a moment to honor the Reverend Dr. Jesse Jackson, who this past weekend had a stupendous effort, as he always does, with Operation Rainbow Push, for its outstanding national convention. The many people who have come over the years. This will not be a moment that I will take to completely pay tribute to Reverend Jackson, but I could not come to the floor without expressing my deep and abiding admiration for him. I've always said that Reverend Jackson, when no one else would be there to comfort those who are deprived, depressed, and simply outraged because of discrimination in this nation, it would be the Reverend Dr. Jesse Louis Jackson who would be present and would be in the most difficult of situations. And isn't it amazing, over 50 years, decades of consistently doing this, being the first African American to run for president. And frankly, I will say that I am in public service because of Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson. My first run was 1984, and I would not have won way down in Houston, Texas, had it not been for the unbelievable uprising, positive uprising of voters who were moved, energized, rushing to the polls, excited, and for those of us who happened to be on the ballot for the first time, a young African-American woman seeking to be a judge in the county of Harris. I could not have made those steps without the unbelievable leadership and the courage of not only Reverend Jackson, but his wife and his family, because they were doing it together. So let me, again, express my appreciation, and I know it was a stupendous conference, and I know that he has selected and given the anchor to a great leader, but it is a great leader who can make choices of greatness, and he has done so. I will just very quickly start on this gun violence prevention and public safety. Excuse my raspy voice, and I will not take long, but just to say, do we need to say it? Every day, 120 Americans are killed with guns. More than 32,000 people die from gun violence annually, including 2,677 children under 18 years of age. In our respective communities, we see toddlers being shot, 10-year-olds being shot, senior citizens being shot. And let me, in particular, give credit to Houston Police Department, as they have worked very hard to bring down homicides, investigate homicides, and the numbers have gone down. but it is very clear that they are desperately in need of federal action. They desperately need the universal background check, which we have not been able to do. They desperately need, in many instances, the ban on assault weapons. They desperately need the requirements of gun storage. My bill, H.R. 52, the Kimberly Vaughn Firearms Safe Storage Act, named in honor of Kimberly Vaughn, a student at Santa Fe High School who was just 17 years of age when a student entered her art class with a stolen gun and killed 10 people. Stolen from the home. These guns were laid out and were owned by a family member. Firearm injury is the leading cause of death, as I said, of children. Is it difficult to require the manufacturer to say, store your gun and provide storage devices? Is it difficult for the retailer to provide storage devices? Is it difficult to be able to say, as a nation, we believe in the Second Amendment, but life is so much more important? And so when children as young as 9 and 10 are the victims of drive-by shootings intended for someone else, but it doesn't matter. I'm reminded of children from Chicago to Houston who have been shot innocently, or shot in the bed, or a woman who was shot in her house as the bullet whizzed close to her. And so I am rising today to say that not only must we stop the gun violence, but we must also draw, as the Congressional Black Caucus has done, to support funding for violence intervention, gun violence intervention. That is an important piece, and we must expand responsibility to ensure that we give tools to the community to stop violence. Workforce programs as well are very important. We must do it with our cities and do it with our law enforcement. Now is the time to stop gun violence in America and save lives. I yield back.
I would like to thank the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas. I would like to yield my time to the Honorable Kamlager Dove, Congresswoman from the great state of California.
Thank you. I want to give thanks again to the gentleman from Illinois and the gentlewoman from Florida for holding this special order hour. And I just want to give my deep appreciation to the Congressional Black Caucus for always using this time for us to talk about timely and relevant issues. Last week, the gasp heard around the world came after a colleague from the other side of the aisle was talking about the National Defense Authorization Act, about the military, about veterans, and decided to call black people colored people, something you haven't heard in decades. I thought to myself, we are beyond this. Haven't we gotten beyond this? Well, I guess we have not. And the response was, the person misspoke. So I'm going to pause after saying that, because I still don't understand how that could be. It is not an ignorant slip of the tongue. You do not misspeak. If you're going to say that, that's because it's front of mind. It's because that's how you see black people. It's probably because that's what you've called black people. What's also interesting is that they are not here in the chamber to hear this, to reflect on that kind of ignorance. I know we are in a period of time where we want to be aggressive, hyper-aggressive. We want to push the envelope. We want to stoke fires. But I'm here to tell you that we are not going to take the bait. Black people are not going to be used as bait in these culture wars. And we're also not going to stand by and let you demoralize us, dehumanize us. What is important to note is that the majority of the people who are in these chambers every single day, helping us do this work, keeping us safe, running this floor are black. How shameful is it? While they are making sure that we are doing the people's business, to then be called that. Men and women who could be our grandmothers, our parents, who fought in the civil rights movement to make sure that democracy was here in these chambers for all of us. It is fear and cowardice and ignorance that would allow those words to come out of your mouth. It is important that you know Black people are not going anywhere. We are here. We are in these chambers. We are in these committees. We are in your districts. We are your constituents. And show some respect. Show some respect. In my community, people like to say, you need to put some respect on my name. And I didn't think that we were going to have to say that in these chambers. But I see we do. So, this is why we should not be banning books. This is why reading is so fundamental. This is why history is important. Because if we remove ourselves far enough from it, we start to make the same mistakes over again. And no one wants that to happen. We are celebrating this year the March on Washington. We are fighting against forces that want to keep us from voting, that want to take away our votes, our voice, our children, our presence, our futures. That's a lot. So on top of that, don't be disrespectful and call us out of our name. Colored is for crayons, not to name a person, not to name a race. Let's not get it twisted. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Sidney Kamlager-Dove from the great state of California. I would like to take a point of privilege and speak to the record. Mr. Speaker, may I make an inquiry about the time remaining?
The gentleman has consumed 47 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with a heart burdened by the weight of history and a spirit ignited by the promise of the future. We gather here in these hallowed halls of power where words bear the weight of action and action shapes the destiny of our nation. But the words uttered by our fellow congressman, and I've waited for a sufficient response for him to apologize to the Honorable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty and to other members that seek truth and justice. But he has remained silent, and he says he has misspoken. Misspoken means to also not have been made clear. So if he could clarify his remarks on who is a colored person, as the grandson of two soldiers that fought in U.S. wars, I would like to know what he was speaking about for colored. When my grandparents could not go on the first-class car after returning from Europe, at the Union Station had to go sit in the second-class car for colored people behind Nazi POWs that were allowed to go in the first-class car. We are trying to overcome a horrid racial past. Mr. Crane, I would like to take this opportunity to share with you a little history. When we hear as African Americans, as our brothers and sisters referred to as colored people in the year of 2023, it doesn't just make us uncomfortable, it transports us back through centuries of struggle, resilience, and a pursuit of justice often denied. I stand here before you today, not just as a member of Congress, but a freedom fighter. Our fight as Americans started before the country was even born. It's been over 400 years when the first persons that were imported from Africa had been enslaved. Nearly 2 centuries after, in 1787, our nation held a constitutional convention, Mr. Crane. It was there that the infamous 3/5 compromise was struck. 3 out of 5 Americans that had been enslaved were counted as representations for taxation, not for votes. The humanity of a person was whittled down to a fraction. Can you imagine the audacity, the horror? Just 2 years later, the Honorable Congressman, later in 1789, we stand witness to a profound paradox that happened. The same 1789 that gave birth to this illustrious institution, the United States House of Representatives, founded in 1789. On the one hand, we celebrate the inauguration of our first president, President George Washington. His picture stands proudly in this chamber, a milestone in our nation's narrative. Yet, let us not overlook the uncomfortable truth that this esteemed leader was himself a holder of Americans enslaved. A chilling reminder that our nation's foundation was laid with the sweat and blood of those in chains. In the years that followed, from 1740 to 1834, Southern slave states employed another insidious tool to maintain oppressive status quo, the anti-literacy laws. I have not been able to find any other nation that had enacted anti-literacy laws. Imagine a system so threatened by the enlightenment of its subjugated people that they made it illegal for the enslaved and free people of color to learn to read and write. In 1850, Mr. Crane, the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted, transforming ordinary citizens into accomplices for the slavery system. A free territory was no longer a sanctuary. It could transform into a hunting ground for those seeking freedom. And aiding the enslaved, a profound act of humanity, was suddenly a criminal act, punishable by fine and imprisonment. This act didn't target the enslaved, it cast its nefarious shadow over the entire nation, implicating all in the perpetration of this abhorrent institution. In the wake of this act, Mr. Crane, 7 years later in 1857, the Supreme Court reached a decision in the Dred Scott case that shook the very foundation of freedom and human dignity. The court ruled that all black people, regardless of their status as free or enslaved, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. This wasn't just a judicial ruling, it was a heart-rending affirmation of the racial prejudice deeply rooted in our society, a prejudice that permeated even our nation's highest courts. In the year 1863, we saw a light, the Emancipation Proclamation. Freedom, after 246 years, freedom, it seemed, was finally within our grasp. A bloody civil war fought over the right to keep human beings in bondage ended 2 years later, our nation's deadliest war, and we dared to dream of a new dawn for our people. Yet, as the sun of liberation rose, the shadows of oppression heightened. In a bitter twist of irony, freedom unveiled a new face of subjugation. The Black Codes of 1865 were enacted. Though the iron chains of slavery had been shattered, this new set of manacles were fastened around us, chains woven with legal threads and tightened by the grips of racial bias. They were not as visible as the shackles of old, but they were no less oppressive, no less real. A century later, in 1963, at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave voice to the bitter truth, and I quote, 100 years later, the colored American is still not free, close quote. 100 years after emancipation, the struggle was far from over. We had been unshackled, yet we remained bound by the chains of systemic discrimination, segregation, and marginalization. The term Jim Crow law surfaced in 1892. Just 4 years later, there was Plessy versus Ferguson. The verdict cemented the doctrine of separate but equal, which inherently meant being unequal. Despite these oppressive circumstances, our ancestors fought with courage and determination, Congressman Crane. They fought for the Civil Rights Act in 1866 and fought in 1964, 65, and 1966. Our ancestors fought for the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. Our ancestors fought for the 14th Amendment to have equal protection under the law and guaranteeing citizenship. They fought for the 15th Amendment so that we could have the right to vote for African American men. These victories did not come easy. They were fought with blood, sweat, and tears of our forebears. Today we find ourselves in 2023, but the echoes of our past are loud. Our colleague, Mr. Crane, has evoked the ghost of a very painful past by addressing us in this chamber as colored people. We've served in every war, Mr. Crane, a term as archaic as the prejudices it represents. In doing so, he blurs the line between past and present, reminding us of an era we've struggled to move beyond. His words are not just a singular lapse in judgment, but a symptom of a much larger disease, a disease that seeped into the highest courts of our land, where the 14th Amendment, the very symbol of our freedom, has been twisted into a weapon against affirmative action. This very amendment, a cornerstone of liberty and equality, has been misused to dismantle a policy intended to level a playing field that has been historically skewed against African Americans. Our attention is then drawn to the targets of this regressive decision. Think about it. Harvard University, founded in 1636. The University of North Carolina, founded in 1789. The Supreme Court in 2023 cited the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868 in the name of Make America Great Again. Now we have our colleague, Mr. Crane, using the words colored, the words that my mother and father had to see growing up in South Carolina and Florida and Virginia for colored water fountains, colored schools. Can we please move forward? Can we please demand an apology to this great body of distinguished men and women from Mr. Crane? So I ask, is it truly a coincidence that these specific institutions have been targeted for the battleground for the dismantling of affirmative action? Or is it an insidious reminder of our painful history, a pointed jab at the very heart for our struggle for equality and access and opportunity? We have been the African American community has been in bondage longer than we've ever been free. Our exclusion has lasted longer than our inclusion. Even half a century after the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we ask ourselves, are we truly free to meritocratically grow? This timeline, this history, is a testament to our resilience. It is a reminder of our past, a measure of our progress, and a marker of the journey ahead. We stand on the shoulders of those who have come before us, those who fought, those who've struggled, and those who have sacrificed. We owe it to them and to ourselves to keep the flame of justice burning bright. This journey has been long, and it is not over, but we will not falter, we will not tire, we will not rest until we can unequivocally say that we are free, until justice is not just a word in our Pledge of Allegiance, but a reality in our lives. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make an inquiry of time.
The gentleman has consumed 58 minutes and 47 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield the controlling balance of my time. How do I close out? There you go. I would like to make a motion, Mr. Speaker, to adjourn the House.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.